and welcome to another edition of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. You know, as the COVID health crisis rumbles along, its knockdown effects are felt directly and in combination with other challenging issues that Canada was facing before COVID had hit. In Canada, COVID combines with several specific challenges, such as oil and gas, a productivity gap, and now yawning deficits. With us to discuss this is Dr. Jack Mintz, who is the President's Fellow School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary and chair of the Alberta Premier's Economic Recovery Council. Jack, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
I'd like to start the program by, obviously, we're still in the COVID economy, and we've seen the federal books now. Where is the economy now, and where is the Canadian economy going?
Well, I think things are still very uncertain. I mean, part of it is we don't know whether we're going to have more lockdowns in the fall or in the springtime. Of course, our American neighbors, which are very important for many of our industries in Canada, they're going through their uncertainties. They've had a recent resurgence, although a lot of it is younger people. We'll have to see, what happens in the U.S., but there's already some news today that that there's been some more unemployment in the U.S. as the economies have slowed down again. So I think it's very hard to predict what next year is going to be like, starting in the after the summer. We've had a good return in May and June, better than I think a number of people expected. They were expecting a fairly strong third quarter coming out of the rebound. Not strong enough to put us back to January of 2020, but certainly a very good rebound to at least from the bottom or the trough that we've experienced. But I think if you look at all the forecasts now, even under the most optimistic scenario of no further lockdowns and further some growth, is that it's not going to be until 2021 that we're going to actually get back to our pre-COVID days. So it's going to be, a very deep recession that we're going to have in 2020. We'll come back, and of course, if there are more lockdowns and it's deeper, and more bankruptcies and everything else that comes along with it, it's going to be a slow grind to come out of this. So I look at really a scenario forecasting now. I don't think anyone can put numbers exactly what's going to happen. There's an optimistic scenario and there's a pessimistic scenario. And I should mention the optimistic one is if they find a vaccine at the end of this year. That would be a huge benefit, I think, to the whole world if that happens.
In terms of economic confidence as well as public health, I guess you're saying.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the health and the economics are tied together, and if we can get back to a more normal life on the health side, that's going to really help the economy. And let's face it, the economy was not in bad shape as we were going into before this COVID situation occurred, and we've had a major supply shock in the sense that the economy had to be stopped in order to prevent the transmission of the disease. And so to the extent that we can deal with this disease in a way that we don't have to shut down the economy, that's really what we need to get to at that point.
We got about a minute before the break. I'd love to get your 1 minute take on the economic statement out of the federal government a few weeks back. What did you think of that?
Well, it's not surprising. I think what I'm most disappointed in is the kind of discussion that we're having around it. It's a huge deficit. Everybody was expecting it, and we knew that we had to spend money to prevent people from going deeper in the hole. People were running out of cash, et cetera, et cetera. It could be even a worse recession if we didn't have a certain amount of spending. But there could have been more care with the spending, and I can go at that length. So maybe we'll save that for a later time.
We will indeed. We're just going to go to a break right now, but we'll carry on with this important discussion with Dr. Jack Mintz. Stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. With me today is Dr. Jack Mintz, a senior economist and definitely one who's got his finger on the pulse of the economic future of the country. Dr. Mintz, thank you for joining us. We were talking about the federal government fiscal situation. What's your take on what does that portend for the average Canadian in terms of taxes and in terms of the impact of future interest rates?
Well, I think that given the very large deficit that's been happened, a lot of people are predicting that we might see more higher interest rates and higher inflation, but that will depend on monetary policy. If monetary policy operates in a way that the money multiplier doesn't lead to, let's say, printing money, that banks lend out money to the public then deposits money back with the banks then lend out more money. That's what causes the demand to go up for goods and services. And with supply shock, that could lead to more inflation. But if the bank continues having a target for inflation and convinces the public that it's going to maintain that target, then I think that it's a better chance that we won't see a huge amount of inflation. However, we are going to have this very significant debt burden now for the country, not just at the federal level, but at the provincial levels as well. And there's really only two or three things that you can do out of it. I mean, if you don't print money and cause inflation to inflate out of it, then the other option is to try to get more growth, and that will mean try to get people back to work and try to get more growth in the economy. And as GDP grows, then and tax revenues come back, then you can end up getting the debt GDP ratio falling over time, and that could be one scenario. Another scenario is that governments try to engage in austerity, which would be either putting the lid on spending or raising taxes. And if you go back to the 2008 financial crisis, which was deep, not as deep as this COVID crisis, but if you go back to the financial crisis and the slowdown that occurred at that time, you can then see that actually governments didn't let inflation rip. Monetary policy kept interest rates down. There was a very slow growth to get out of the situation. But what's very interesting is that, and I've done some work on this now, across the OECD, there was no increase in the tax GDP ratio.
Interesting.
There was changes in tax policy. There were, governments got more interested in redistribution because of concerns over inequality. So there were higher personal tax rates at the top, but then there were tax rates given at the bottom. There was some increase in sales tax, but not very much as a share of GDP. Corporate tax rates kept falling after the 2010. Why? Because I think governments are worried about growth. And that's the problem with increasing taxes. If it's going to be a while before economies are going to recover with more growth, it's very hard for governments to start raising taxes. People are short of cash. You need to get more investment going. You need to get people back to work, start raising taxes, and it makes it very difficult. And so when you look at the experience after the financial crisis, there wasn't an increase in the tax GDP ratio. There was actually a significant decline due to the recession, and then the tax ratio went up somewhat after that, but not as much as you think. And that, I think, is really quite interesting about what happened. And that's across all OECD countries. I should add, actually, Canada did raise its tax GDP ratio relative to what it was before 2009, but that only happened after 2015. And that's when 2014, that's when federal and provincial governments started raising taxes after that point. But that was quite unique experience compared to a number of other countries.
So it might be that the confidence of consumers is going to trump using austerity and tax increases to get back to a balanced situation, or even close to balance. We'll take that thought and leave it for now. We've got some sector-specific conversations I'd love to have with you. We're going to come back after the break and delve right into that, so stay tuned. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. With me today is Dr. Jack Mintz, senior economist, President's Fellow School of Public Policy, University of Calgary. Jack, thank you for joining us. I'd love to get into some specifics. Specifically, let's talk firstly about oil and gas and then manufacturing. Oil and gas, of course, there was a crisis going on in oil and gas before COVID hit in terms of the machinations between Russia and Saudi and its impact on the domestic scene. And then manufacturing has seen a slow decline, and certainly there may be an impact with the new USMCA. I'd love to have your thoughts first on the oil and gas sector and secondly on the manufacturing sector.
Well, first in the oil and gas, the Saudi Arabian war actually, Russian war actually, the oil price war actually took place just at the start of COVID, which shocked everybody. Like, why would you, at the worst time possible, when you know that demand is going to drop like a stone, why would you start engaging in a price war? And there were a lot of people that were predicting this price war may last some time because the Russians particularly wanted to try to bury the U.S. Shale oil industry. And they had a Roosevelt express that publicly himself. But actually, I was very convinced that that was not going to happen. Economics would just dominate. I mean, the Russian budget, I forget the exact portion, but it's like over almost 50% or over 50%, dependent on oil revenues. The Saudi Arabian budget depended so much on it. And also their economies. And so it was not surprising that by April they got together. So I have to admit, I was very pessimistic about the price of oil for 2020, thinking that it might average around $30. But now the West Texas Intermediate price is back up to roughly $40, which is much better by June, which is much better than anyone forecasted, and 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 is holding steady. And I think you're going to see that manipulation by OPEC Plus to try to keep prices kind of low enough not to attract a lot of new production coming out of the U.S. And other countries, but at the same time, not letting it precipitously fall like it did. And they'll try to play that game. That's good news, I think, for the Canadian economy and Alberta, particularly, and Newfoundland. Much better to have $40 barrels than $20 barrels. And we may even see that as over time, the lack of investment in the industry right now, and the fact that reserves deplete, that eventually prices may actually go higher down the road, and we may get back to in 2 or 3 years' time to $60 barrels. And I should say that also the inventory buildup is coming down. The U.S. Government agency that does these forecasts actually has suggested inventories will be eliminated by the end of this year, and so, or at least the buildup will be eliminated by the end of this year. So all that sort of suggests that certainly that helps to some degree, but no question that the Alberta and Newfoundland, Saskatchewan economies were most hit by the decline in oil and gas. The longer run issue is, I think, more of the Canadian issue about climate change and what do we mean by going to net zero emissions. Nobody really has a plan. They have aspirations, but a plan means you actually know how you're going to get there, and it's based on right now the plans that I've seen, whether the International Energy Agency or others. There all these plans are based on some new technology that's not yet available or commercialized. And in fact, there's a very good analysis I just read this week that came out of J.P. Morgan that basically said, "Look, we're not going to get to zero net emissions by 2050 worldwide. It's just almost impossible to do that." And that's what most experts would say in terms of what you do. It doesn't mean you still keep working on the technologies,
Right.
but there's going to be still demand for fossil fuels over the next 30, 40 years, and that's not going to disappear immediately. And so if Canada's got to really come down to some sort of accommodation for responsible energy development, or else it's going to rip apart the country if we don't. And so I think it's an absolutely critical issue for the post-recovery COVID period.
We're going to turn from that to the manufacturing sector, but we'll do that right after the break. Stay with us as we continue our discussion with Dr. Jack Mintz. Stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. With me today is Dr. Jack Mintz. Jack, thank you for joining this program. We dissected the oil and gas sector just before the break. Love to get your take on the manufacturing sector, what the prospects of the Canadian manufacturing sector are.
Well, I think actually would be somewhat bullish about manufacturing over the next number of years, and there's really, I think, three reasons for that. First of all, the auto industry and auto parts industry, which is so crucial to Ontario, just like energy is to Alberta, is going to get supported by the new U.S.-Mexico-Canadian treaty, which is going to require more parts to be built in, or parts or more value added to be built in North America, and so that's going to be, I think, somewhat helpful to the auto industry. So I think that's one thing in the manufacturing side that's positive, and also we also forget that petrochemicals are also manufacturing, and there's great interest in building up petrochemical plants in Alberta. In fact, Alberta just announced a new credit, royalty credit to encourage petrochemical plants in Alberta, and I think you're going to see there's going to be a lot of interest in doing that in Alberta, partly because of the costs reasons, but also because of Alberta's new low corporate income tax rate, which is very attractive for large companies coming to the province, as well as regulatory changes, including the new system is much better than the previous one that was set up by the NDP government, where this one is going to be inviting any company to come in rather than picking only certain companies. So that's going to be a much better approach that the government's going to be using. So those manufacturing looks good. And the third item, which I think is also very important, is the fact that I think we are going to see a shortening of supply chains, and it's going to be a risk management issue, I think, for a lot of companies. Even though you have much lower costs in different countries around the world, especially less developed countries, for amount of your production, and that still will be a big draw for many companies. But you become much more dependent on these faraway places for parts, and so when things happen that make things difficult, and then you can be caught short of supplies, and then you have trouble managing your supply chain. So it's going to be very interesting how this works out. I think there's still going to be a great deal of interest in that, but certainly the hostilities right now between China and the United States, which is going to slop over into Canada as well, as I think we're going to be very careful in our relationship with China, also suggests that some of those supply chains may be affected by those hostilities that are going to develop. So I see all these kind of factors helping. And then a final one, which I would say is a fourth item, but certainly I think an overall one is tremendous innovation that's now taking place in that can allow for much lower manufacturing costs in North America, whether it's artificial intelligence or robotics or whatever. And companies are going to be very serious about investing in it. And this is where I worry a bit for Canada, in that we tend to be slow in adopting new innovations. In fact, it's not just a matter of R&D; it's also businesses getting new capital and improving their productivity. That has not happened. In fact, productivity rates have been absolutely flat since 2015. And when we come into this COVID, if we want to deal with issues like debt and try to get more tax revenues coming to the economy, and governments being able to supply goods and services, and people getting jobs and everything else, we're going to have to do a lot better on the productivity front. And I think that's going to be a huge challenge for for Canada. Otherwise, we'll
I
lose out in
sense
competitiveness, particularly to the
I
United
sense
States.
we have a whole other show we got to do on productivity and your work on the Premier's Economic Recovery Council as well. Dr. Jack Mintz, thank you so much for joining us. That was definitely a full program, and we'd love to have you back in the future as well. Having just interviewed Dr. Jack Mintz, I came away with a certain amount of optimism for the manufacturing sector, the oil and gas sector, and generally the economic recovery. It sounds like we've got a lot of work to do, but the fundamentals seem to be strong. We'll be following this story for many months to come, that is for sure. Thank you for joining us today.